why is that he manages to synthesize both the profound Augustinian piety with the scientific Aristotelian rational approach to the world. And in this way, Aquinas manages a balance that is truly unique in the history of thought. It's a remarkable synthesis, and we'll see how they can play out in answering the question, how should we live? The masterwork, which he did not complete, this work, the Summa Theologiae, is an incredible masterpiece of thought. It has three major parts: the prima pars, the first part; the secunda pars, the second part; and the tertia pars. This reading that we have tonight is the beginning of the second part, and that second part is the largest section in the work. It is the ethics section. It itself is so large that it's split into two subparts. So this is called the prima secundae, the first and the second. And these are the questions 2 through 4 that we've got here. We did not include the very first question. The questiones are themselves divided into several other questions, these articles that we grapple with today. The prologue of the whole second part is a masterpiece of concision, and I'll read it here. We did not include it. Since, as Damascene states, man is said to be made in God's image, insofar as the image implies an intelligent being endowed with free will and self-movement, now that we have treated of the exemplar, that is, God, and of those things which came forth from the power of God in accordance with his will, that was what he dealt with in the first part, it remains for us to treat of his image, that is, man, inasmuch as he too is the principle of his actions, as having free will and control of his actions. So there's a very strong emphasis on freedom, on the liberty of humanity in our making our way back to God, and that's what the whole ethical life is for. That's what the second part is about, the pursuit of the final end, happiness, the virtues and the vices, grace. The third part is still part of this return. So we have this grand scheme of that the Summa is basically shaped by. You have God, and then everything coming from God, that is the exitus, the creation, and that's what you see in the first part. And then everything's returning back to God, and that's the reditus, exitus reditus, this grand circular movement. Well, that movement back to God of humanity requires our free choice to pursue the good thing. And then in the third part, what you see is that this is all through Christ, and that's the specifically theological part of this ethical consideration. But here we have in the second part these a way of presenting, especially Aristotelian ethics, but in a way that is profoundly transformed by the Christian revelation. So whereas in Aristotle we have the definition from the Nicomachean Ethics that happiness is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue throughout the whole of life, that is something that Aquinas is taking as a baseline. But then when we get to the punchline of what he says happiness is, it's what the tradition calls the beatific vision. And the way Aquinas describes that is that it's the vision of God through God's own essence. That somehow we see that we see God by having God's own essence be the form of our intellect. It's an astonishing description. As we see, though, it also is very intellectualist. It doesn't do a lot with the things that we tend to associate with happiness, especially in the modern world. Do we recognize this vision of the end of what it means to be human? Do we recognize that as something desirable now? And that's something we'll grapple with in this discussion. Aquinas was born in 1224 or 1225 of a noble family in the family castle at Roccasecca, which is between Rome and Naples. He was a second cousin of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, so a very international man. His family wanted him to become the abbot of the Benedictine monastery Monte Cassino, but he wanted to become a mendicant, and that was a revolutionary decision. It is something the family did not want. They, in fact, they kidnapped him when he was trying to get to the Dominicans, and they trapped him in a tower, and they even sent a prostitute in to try to lure him away from the mendicant life. This is there's a lot of drama in his life, but what we know him for is the power of his intellect, which really, there are very few minds in the history of the world that can compare with his. He just lived to be a thinker and a theologian. That was his passion. That's what drove him. That's what he lived off of. He started work on the Summa probably in Rome, and completed it in one of his, well, actually he had to go back. He was in Paris many times. So his main university position was at the University of Paris, which he was at different occasions in his life. And there he had had to deal with, on the one hand, the kind of Averroistic, radical Aristotelian faculty of arts tendency. And there was also a strong tendency in the theology faculty to try to bring theology away from the scholastic method of dealing with theological questions, which had been really developed in the previous century, in the 1100s. And we saw this when we discussed Abelard. Abelard was a key figure in that. A former bishop of Paris, Peter Lombard, also in the mid-1100s, was with his sentences, which gathered a vast amount of views on different topics of theology and presented them next to each other. Abelard had a work called Sic et Non, the yes and no, juxtaposing authorities and saying authorities that seem to disagree with each other. So the question was, how could we reconcile authorities, the scripture, the fathers of the church, philosophical sources? How do we make sense of all of that? And that was the beginning of this kind of scholastic method of really vigorously pursuing questions that would arise from these grand monuments from the past. That was not the monastic way. The monastic way was to listen to these authorities and to comment on these authorities. But the scholastics wanted to get in there and argue and try to work things out. And that energy of thought drove the 13th century. And so that is the kind of energy that you see in Aquinas in a paradigmatic way. He had his great early master, Albert the Great, who was also a Dominican. So he had impeccable training, and his energy of thought was astonishing. He wrote this huge second part of the Summa in about 18 months, which it's hard to grasp how one man could do such a thing. He apparently dictated, though, so he had a team of secretaries who could take down his thoughts. Would all of us were so lucky to have that. He died in 1274 on the way to the Council of Lyon. He hit his head on a tree, and that didn't do away with him right off. He took to the bed, though, and he died. A few months before that, it's said that he had mystical experiences, and he said that he couldn't write anymore because all that he has written is nothing but straw compared to what he's seen. So he did have a mystical, he had access to a real intensity of relationship with God, which you can tell is there if you can get beyond the kind of difficulties of his writing. The Summa is meant to be a kind of beginner's textbook. It's always joked about that's the case, but it was there to present for Dominicans who couldn't go to university a systematic context, especially for hearing confessions, but also for the preaching, these two great tasks that the Dominicans took on. So this Aquinas looked around at the theological textbooks of the day and said, this is not, and the moral manuals of the day, and he said, this is not systematic enough to do the job, to meet the needs of the people of God. So he composed this Summa Theologiae in order to put everything into a massive and beautiful system. And the structure, as you've noticed, is to have each article be a question, and that energy of following questions is that energy of thought really is the lifeblood of his work. It is when the scholastic method is doing what it ought to do. That's what it's being fueled by. In each article, defined by a question, you have objectors who present different voices. What you hear are voices of authorities. What you hear is the sound of the disputation method in the university, where there would be vigorous public argument. And you have objections raised. Then you have a kind of authority cited, the sed contra on the contrary, which is not necessarily Aquinas' view. So you've got that sic et non, you've got objections, different voices, then you have an authoritative voice, but then he has his response, respondio, I respond that, and that's the corpus of the article. And then based on the work that he's done there in the response, he goes back to each objection and gives an answer. So it is a very dialogical form. I mean, you say the word scholastic and people think, oh, that's so dry. And it can't, I mean, there were decadent forms of this, but the thing in its newness was very urbane. It was something that was meant to give the human spirit the scope to pursue questions vigorously, to let faith give rise to thinking. And I still think that is the great model that we should be, speaking as a Catholic theologian, that we should still be following. So he did write most of the second part in Paris as his final stay there, and then he did not complete the thing. That's a great shame, but as God wills. So I know that the reading is dense, and I'm happy to be maybe more of a guide than I usually am, but one, I think, important distinction, you kind of have to ferret these things out when you're reading, but you would have noticed, but it's probably worth saying, that he makes a very important distinction between the essence of happiness and that which constitutes happiness. And if you look for that, it's going to solve a lot of the puzzles, because that which constitutes happiness is God, but happiness is something in us, which is a common sense thing. When you say you're happy, that's not something outside of you. It's not because you've got hold of something. It's not because of the thing you've gotten hold of that you say you're happy. You're happy. You've been made happy because of the thing that constitutes your happiness. So that distinction is going to make sense of a lot of our puzzles there. So I will leave it at that for now. Oh, the questions. I will read those.
Thanks.
What would make you happy? Aquinas begins, it's actually the second article, but the beginning of our reading of the treatise on happiness surveys created goods. And he goes from external goods, like wealth and power, to goods of the body, which, so he's moving up from things that are outside of us to things that are touch on our body, and then goods of the soul, that is the higher powers of our soul, the intellectual powers. And he says none of these can fully satisfy our desires. So our happiness cannot be in those things and attaining those things. So he surveys the created goods as contenders for bringing about our happiness. Does this traversal help you in thinking through what's important in life? Question 2, what is Aquinas' definition of happiness? In what way does he appropriate Aristotle's definition of happiness, which is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue throughout the whole of life? In what way does Aquinas transform this definition? For Aquinas, what is it that brings about union with God? Is there a place in his vision for what we might call the heart? And that's something I'm just kind of bringing in as a consideration. He has a very intellectualist view of what fulfills our nature. For Aquinas, are mystery, embodiment, communion, creativity essential to happiness?